The jungle whispered secrets in a tongue that only the brave or the foolish would dare to interpret. Towering trees, their barks slick with bioluminescent moss, rose like silent sentinels into the canopy, blocking out the twin suns of the planet Relaxis 4. Beneath their shadowy embrace, the air was thick, not just with the heavy humidity of an untamed world, but with a palpable tension that seemed to hum in Elias' heart's very bones. He stood at the edge of the research perimeter, the barrier that had kept humans safe from the Relaxians for the past 8 years. The safe zone, as the crew called it, was little more than a wide clearing ringed with sensor towers and automated turrets. Beyond lay the untamed wilderness, where death could come silently and swiftly, from a Relaxian predator's claws, a carnivorous plant's waiting maw, or simply the jungle itself, which seemed alive in ways science had yet to explain. And yet something was calling him. Elias adjusted the strap of his field pack, his every movement slow and deliberate. His colleagues, still clustered around the command tent, had stopped paying attention to him hours ago. They thought he was cataloging samples from the clearing's edge. They had no idea what he intended to do. Not yet. A strange sound reached his ears, faint at first, but unmistakable. A rhythm, low, guttural, almost like a chant, echoed from somewhere deep within the jungle. It was unlike anything he had heard during his time on Relaxis, and Elias had heard plenty. The high-pitched wail of hunting Relaxians, the mournful cries of prey animals as they succumbed, even the eerie rustling of plants that seemed to shift of their own volition. This was different, purposeful, intimate. The sound pulled at something primal within him, something curious and reckless. It spoke to the part of Elias that had driven him to choose xenology as his field, that had pushed him to study species others deemed too dangerous or unapproachable. "Don't do anything stupid," Captain Mara Sloane's voice crackled over the comm in his earpiece, a routine check-in. He hesitated, glancing back toward the command tent. Mara's voice had that sharp edge it always did when she was about to reprimand him. It was a tone born of long years in military service before she'd been contracted by Earth's corporate interests to lead this expedition. "I won't," Elias lied, tapping the comm off. The jungle loomed before him, vast and forbidding. He knew what lay beyond. The Relaxians, a species shrouded in both mystery and fear. To humans they were savage, territorial creatures, their society bound by laws as primal as the world they inhabited. But to Elias, they were something else, a puzzle yet unsolved. He crossed the perimeter. The moment his boots sank into the mossy ground of the jungle, it felt as though the air itself shifted. The oppressive heat grew heavier, and the distant sounds of the camp faded until they were swallowed entirely by the thrum of the jungle's life. Even the sensor's faint hum disappeared behind him, leaving only the heartbeat of Relaxis in his ears. His datapad vibrated against his thigh, the AI assistant within warning him of his violation of the restricted zone. He ignored it, his focus narrowing to the strange, rhythmic sound ahead. Each step felt deliberate, the ground beneath him giving way to patches of glowing fungi and twisted roots. Here and there, his eyes caught glimpses of movement, small creatures darting through underbrush, their bioluminescent trails vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Above, the canopy swayed, though there was no wind to move it. And then he saw her. At first, it was just a shadow, a massive figure outlined against the faint glow of phosphorescent vines. She stood motionless, her golden eyes catching the faintest light and reflecting it back like polished amber. Kira. Elias's breath caught. He had seen her before, through the shaky feed of drone cameras and the wary accounts of other researchers. But seeing her like this, in the flesh, was entirely different. Her scales shimmered faintly in hues of green and gold, catching the light as she moved, slow and deliberate, into the clearing. She was taller than any human, her posture both regal and predatory. Her shoulders were broad, her limbs corded with muscle, and her clawed hands rested lightly at her sides, as though she could summon violence in an instant, but chose not to. Her gaze pinned him in place, and for a moment, the jungle seemed to still, as though it too was watching. Elias raised his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the jungle's ever-present hum. He didn't speak. Words felt inadequate in the face of this encounter. Kira tilted her head slightly, her golden eyes narrowing. She took a single step forward, and the sound of her movement, soft but deliberate, seemed deafening in the silence. Elias stayed rooted to the spot, his instincts warring within him. Every part of his training, every warning Mara and the others had given him, screamed at him to retreat. But he couldn't. Something about Kira's gaze held him in place, as though she were not just assessing him, but seeing through him. And then, to his utter disbelief, she raised a hand. The motion was slow, deliberate, and it took him a moment to understand its meaning. She was mirroring him, her clawed hand open, palm facing him. An invitation, or perhaps a challenge. Behind him the jungle whispered again, the rhythmic chant growing louder. It felt as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Elias stepped forward. The distance between them closed slowly, agonizingly, every step feeling heavier than the last. His gaze never left hers, and hers never left his. When he was close enough to see the minute details of her scales, each one catching the faint light in intricate patterns, she spoke. The sound of her voice was low, resonant, a vibration that seemed to echo not just in his ears, but in his chest. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, curious, cautious, and something else he couldn't quite name. Elias's hand hovered just inches from hers, the space between them charged with an energy that felt alive. And then her claws brushed his skin, light as a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a sharp guttural cry broke the stillness, a warning that shattered the fragile moment. Kira's head snapped toward the sound, her golden eyes narrowing. The jungle erupted in motion. Elias had no time to think as she stepped past him, her body tensed like a coiled spring, ready to strike. Whatever had been watching them from the shadows was no longer content to remain unseen. The mystery of the Relaxians was no longer a distant puzzle. It was here, breathing down his neck, and Elias had crossed into a world that might never let him go. The jungle was alive, every sound sharp and immediate, cutting through the thick, humid air like a blade. The cry that shattered the fragile connection between Elias and Kira still reverberated in his ears as she stepped past him, her body coiled with a tension that was both primal and precise. Elias stumbled back, his boots catching on an exposed root, but his eyes never left Kira. She stood utterly still, her golden gaze piercing the dense shadows ahead, her claws twitching faintly as if anticipating a strike. Around them, the jungle seemed to pulse with life, the luminous fungi at their feet dimming, the faint glow of the canopy above flickering as though responding to an unseen force. And then it came. The creature burst from the underbrush with a snarl, a blur of scaled muscle and jagged teeth. Elias barely registered its form, a predator, four-legged but impossibly fast, before Kira moved. She was a streak of motion, her claws slicing through the air with lethal precision. The beast howled, a high-pitched wail that echoed like a siren, before collapsing into a heap at her feet. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by Elias's ragged breathing. Kira turned, her golden eyes locking onto his once more. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction in her kill, only a cold assessment, as if she were gauging his reaction, his worth. Elias forced himself to stand, his legs trembling. What was that?" he asked, though he doubted she understood him. She didn't respond, at least not with words. Instead, she gestured, an abrupt motion with her clawed hand that seemed to say, "Follow." Without waiting for his consent, she turned and strode deeper into the jungle, her movements fluid and purposeful. For a moment, Elias hesitated. He glanced back the way he had come, where the faint hum of the expedition's perimeter still beckoned like a distant memory of safety. But safety felt meaningless now. There was something in Kira's gaze, something in the way she had spared him and now beckoned him forward, that gnawed at his insatiable curiosity. He followed. The deeper they went, the stranger the jungle became. The familiar hum of life, the chirps, the rustles, the distant calls, faded into a low rhythmic vibration, a pulse that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath Elias's feet. It wasn't sound so much as sensation, a faint tremor that climbed up his legs and settled in his chest. Kira moved with purpose, her steps confident as though guided by an unseen map. Elias tried to keep up, his eyes darting between her and the alien terrain. Here, the bioluminescent flora grew denser, their glow brighter, casting shifting patterns of light across the trees and undergrowth. And then he saw it, a structure, half hidden by the dense foliage. It rose from the jungle floor like a jagged tooth, its surface dark and iridescent, pulsing faintly with the same rhythm he had felt beneath his feet. The air around it was different, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that prickled at his senses. "What is this?" he muttered, stepping closer. Kira blocked his path with a sudden, sharp motion, her arm outstretched. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the structure as though it were alive. Slowly, she moved forward, her claws tracing faint symbols carved into the surface. Elias's curiosity burned. He reached for his datapad, its faint glow a comforting tether to his world. The scanner flickered to life, its readings erratic. Energy signatures spiked and dipped, patterns emerging only to dissolve into chaos. "This isn't natural," he murmured, his voice tinged with awe and unease. Kira turned to him, her expression unreadable. She pointed to the structure, then to the jungle around them, and finally to herself. The sequence was deliberate, as if she were trying to convey something vital. Elias frowned, his mind racing. "You're connected to this?" he ventured, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. She didn't respond. Instead, she placed her hand against the structure's surface, her claws fitting perfectly into the carved grooves. The pulsing rhythm intensified, the air vibrating with a resonance that made Elias's teeth ache. Suddenly, the jungle around them erupted in motion. It wasn't like before, with the singular predator's attack. This was coordinated, shadows moving in unison, figures emerging from the underbrush with a guttural roar that sent shivers down Elias's spine. Relaxians. They were smaller than Kira, but no less fearsome. Their scales glinted darkly in the bioluminescent light, and their claws gleamed as they fanned out, circling Kira and Elias. Their eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of both anger and fear. Elias froze, his heart pounding. He wasn't armed, wasn't trained for this. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Kira stepped forward, placing herself between him and the others. Her posture shifted subtly, her claws flexing as she let out a low, guttural sound that echoed with authority. The other Relaxians hesitated, their movements faltering. Elias could only watch as Kira spoke to them in a language he couldn't begin to decipher. Her voice rose and fell, like the jungle's rhythm, each word a blend of growls and clicks. The others responded, their tones sharper, more aggressive. One stepped forward, taller than the rest, but smaller than Kira. His scales shimmered with a deeper hue, his claws tipped with a metallic sheen. Vorak. Elias didn't need a translator to sense his hostility. Kira and Vorak exchanged words, their tones rising in intensity. Vorak gestured toward Elias, his movements sharp and accusatory. Kira's response was swift, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, and then, without warning, Vorak lunged. Kira met him mid-strike, their claws colliding in a spray of sparks that lit the clearing. The others stepped back, their growls blending with the jungle's rhythm, forming a chorus of tension and anticipation. Elias couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He could only watch as Kira and Vorak clashed, their movements a blur of speed and precision. It wasn't a fight. It was a test. And he was the prize. When it ended, it was as abrupt as it had begun. Vorak stood still, his chest heaving, his claws clenched at his sides. Blood, dark and viscous, dripped from a shallow cut across his arm. Kira stood before him, unyielding, her golden eyes blazing. Vorak snarled, a sound of frustration and submission. He stepped back, his gaze lingering on Elias with a promise of future reckoning. Kira turned to Elias, her expression unreadable once more. She extended a clawed hand, her gesture clear. Come. Elias hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of fear, awe, and questions. But as he placed his hand in hers, the jungle's rhythm surged around them, louder than ever. He had crossed a line, deeper than the physical boundary of the jungle, and there would be no turning back. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire ecosystem were aware of what had just transpired. Elias followed Kira deeper into the labyrinth of twisted roots and glowing flora, his thoughts spiraling as the events of the last hour replayed in his mind. Vorak's feral gaze lingered at the forefront, a reminder that he was trespassing not only in the jungle, but also in a web of tensions he barely understood. Kira's pace never faltered, her movements fluid and deliberate as she led him further away from the safety of the camp and deeper into the unknown. The bioluminescence around them seemed to brighten, casting the world in hues of green and blue. The air was heavy, vibrating faintly with the same rhythmic pulse Elias had felt at the strange structure. He had questions, so many questions, but no way to ask them. His datapad remained useless for communication, its rudimentary algorithms struggling to decode even a fraction of the Relaxian language. And yet, Kira seemed to understand his hesitation. Without warning, she stopped and turned to face him. The golden glow of her eyes softened, and she made a series of deliberate gestures, pointing to the ground, to her chest, and then to him. The sequence was slow and purposeful, her expression expectant. Elias furrowed his brow, trying to make sense of her actions. You want me to trust you? He guessed, his voice low, almost reverent in the thick stillness. Kira tilted her head slightly, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. Then she pointed at the ground again and crouched, clawed fingers brushing aside a tangle of vines to reveal what lay beneath. A stone. But it wasn't just any stone. Its surface was dark and smooth, marked with intricate patterns that glowed faintly with the same rhythmic pulse as the structure they had seen earlier. The patterns were unlike anything Elias had encountered, fluid, almost organic, as though they had grown naturally rather than been carved. Kira touched the stone with her palm, and the patterns brightened, casting her face in an ethereal light. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating deep within Elias's chest. "What is this?" he whispered, crouching beside her. She didn't answer in words. Instead, she placed her hand over his and guided it to the stone's surface. The effect was immediate. Elias gasped as a surge of warmth spread from his hand to the rest of his body, the pulse of the stone syncing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. His vision blurred, and for a moment he felt weightless, as if the jungle around him had disappeared entirely. Images flashed in his mind, fragments of places and moments that weren't his own. He saw a vast network of glowing stones, each connected by threads of light that wove through the jungle like veins. He saw Relaxians, hundreds of them, gathered around the stones, their hands outstretched in what looked like reverence. He saw Kira standing at the center of it all, her expression fierce and determined. And then, just as quickly as it began, the vision ended. Elias was back in the jungle, his hand trembling as he pulled it away from the stone. "What?" He struggled to find his voice. "What did I just see?" Kira stood, her gaze intense. She gestured toward the jungle ahead, then to the stone and finally back to him. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if she were giving him time to process. "This is connected to the entire planet," Elias said, more to himself than to her. "A network. But for what?" Kira didn't answer. Instead, she extended her hand to him again, her expression urging him to follow. They walked for what felt like hours, though Elias couldn't be sure. Time seemed to blur in the jungle, the bioluminescence shifting in intensity as if the world itself were breathing. Kira led him to another clearing, this one dominated by a massive stone structure that rose like a mountain from the jungle floor. Its surface was covered in the same glowing patterns as the stone they had touched, but these pulsed with a more erratic rhythm, as if something was out of balance. As they approached, Elias's datapad vibrated violently, its screen flickering with a chaotic array of data. Energy readings spiked off the charts, the device struggling to process the overwhelming input. "This isn't just a relic," Elias murmured. "It's a power source, or something even bigger." Kira stepped forward, her movements reverent. She placed both hands on the structure, and the pulsing patterns shifted, aligning with her touch. The erratic rhythm began to stabilize, the glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. Elias shielded his eyes, his heart racing. "What are you doing?" A deep rumble shook the ground beneath them, and the jungle seemed to react, trees swaying despite the absence of wind, the bioluminescent plants flickering like warning beacons. And then the structure spoke. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, but a deep, resonant vibration that resonated in Elias's bones. The patterns on its surface shifted, forming shapes that looked almost like words, but not in any language he recognized. Kira turned to him, her expression urgent. She pointed to the patterns, then to him, her gestures quick and insistent. "You want me to read this?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. How can I possibly?" The structure's vibrations grew stronger, the patterns shifting faster. Elias's datapad beeped wildly, its translation algorithms struggling to keep up. Words began to form on its screen, fragmented but coherent enough to send a chill down his spine. "Balance, broken, restore, consequence." Elias looked at Kira, his pulse racing. "This network, it's failing, isn't it? That's what this is about." Kira nodded once, her gaze filled with a gravity that made his chest tighten. "But why?" he pressed. "What's causing it?" Before she could respond, a sound tore through the jungle, a deep, guttural roar that sent every instinct in Elias's body into overdrive. Vorak. He emerged from the shadows, flanked by other Relaxians, their eyes burning with fury. Vorak's gaze locked onto Kira, then shifted to Elias, his expression a mix of hatred and disbelief. Kira stepped between them, her claws flexing, her stance defiant. Elias's heart pounded as Vorak barked something in their guttural language, his tone dripping with accusation. Kira responded sharply, her voice filled with a commanding authority that only seemed to enrage him further. The tension was electric, the air thick with the promise of violence. Elias felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the realization dawning that this was no longer just about him or Kira. The fate of the entire planet was at stake. The air between them trembled, heavy with unspoken tension. Vorak's snarls echoed through the clearing, each syllable a guttural accusation, his clawed hands slicing through the humid air to punctuate his fury. Behind him, the other Relaxians watched with predatory stillness, their eyes fixed on Kira as though waiting for her to falter. Kira didn't falter. She stood tall, her golden eyes locked on Vorak, her claws at her sides, ready but not raised. Her voice, when it came, was low and measured, a stark contrast to Vorak's anger. The rhythm of her speech flowed like the jungle's pulse, steady and deliberate, but Elias could feel the weight of her words. She was speaking not just to Vorak, but to the entire assembly, her tone carrying a gravity that made the other Relaxians shift uneasily. Elias stood to the side, his back pressed against the glowing structure. His heart raced, his mind scrambling to piece together the fragments of understanding he had gathered. The network of stones, the failing balance, the ancient warnings etched into the surface. Everything pointed to a catastrophe poised to unravel this world. And now, Vorak was here, his fury threatening to tear apart the fragile thread of alliance Elias and Kira had barely begun to weave. Vorak's voice rose, sharp and accusing, as he thrust a claw toward Elias. The meaning was clear, even without a translator. "This is your fault." Elias swallowed hard. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say? That he was only here to learn, to understand, that he hadn't meant to disrupt their world? Kira's response was swift. She stepped forward, placing herself squarely between Elias and Vorak. Her claws flexed, her golden gaze unyielding as she spoke, her voice rising like a blade cutting through the thick tension. Elias couldn't understand her words, but he understood her intent. She was defending him, protecting him, not as a gesture of trust, but as an assertion of her authority. Vorak's growl deepened, his body coiling with barely restrained aggression. He spat a single word, sharp and venomous, before turning his back on Kira. With a flick of his claw, he signaled to the others, and they melted back into the jungle's shadows, their departure as silent as their arrival. But Vorak lingered. He turned his gaze to Elias one last time, his eyes burning with a promise of reckoning. Then he was gone, disappearing into the bioluminescent haze. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with the release of adrenaline. He looked at Kira, who still stood facing the jungle, her posture tense and watchful. "What now?" he asked softly, though he knew she wouldn't answer. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she gestured for him to follow and began walking toward the structure. Elias hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to return to the expedition camp and the relative safety it offered. But something deeper pulled at him, a gnawing curiosity, a need to understand. He followed her. The structure's interior was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. The glowing patterns that covered its surface extended inside, their light illuminating a cavernous space filled with twisting columns and vaulted ceilings. The air was thick with energy, each breath tinged with the same metallic tang he had noticed earlier. Kira moved with purpose, her steps echoing faintly against the smooth floor. She led him to the center of the chamber, where a pedestal stood bathed in an otherworldly glow. Atop it rested a stone, larger and more intricately patterned than the one they had found earlier. As Elias approached, the air around the stone seemed to hum, the rhythm syncing with his heartbeat. He felt a pull, an almost magnetic draw that made his skin tingle. Kira gestured to the stone, her expression solemn. "You want me to touch it?" Elias asked hesitantly. She nodded once, her gaze unwavering. Elias swallowed hard. Every instinct told him this was a terrible idea, but he couldn't ignore the sense of purpose in Kira's actions. Slowly, he reached out and placed his hand on the stone. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. A surge of energy coursed through him, filling his mind with images and sensations. He saw the network of stones in its entirety, a vast, interconnected web stretching across the planet. He felt its pulse, its rhythm, once steady and harmonious, now fractured and faltering. He saw the Relaxians, their lives intertwined with the network, their very existence dependent on its balance. And he saw the cause of the imbalance, a fissure in the network, a disruption caused by an outside force. Humans. Elias's breath hitched as the realization struck. The expedition's presence, their machinery, their interference, it was all connected to the failing network. If they didn't stop, the entire planet would collapse, taking the Relaxians with it. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Elias gasping for air. He stumbled back, his hand falling away from the stone. Kira caught him before he could fall, her claws gentle against his arm. She looked at him intently, her expression filled with something he hadn't seen before. Hope. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand what you're trying to protect." Kira nodded, her golden eyes steady, but understanding wasn't enough. As they exited the structure, the jungle greeted them with a restless energy. The bioluminescent plants pulsed erratically, their glow flickering like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Elias felt the weight of his knowledge pressing down on him. He had to stop the expedition, had to convince them to leave before it was too late. But how? Captain Sloan and the others wouldn't listen to him, not without proof, and even then, their corporate sponsors wouldn't care about the Relaxians' plight. And then there was Vorak. Elias glanced at Kira as they walked, her silhouette sharp against the glowing foliage. She was their leader, their guardian, but her authority was fragile, constantly challenged by those like Vorak, who saw humans as nothing but invaders. To save this planet, Elias would need more than Kira's trust. He would need to bridge the divide between their species, to unite them against the greater threat. But could he do it? As the jungle's pulse quickened around them, Elias felt the stakes rise like a tide, threatening to engulf him. Time was running out. The jungle sang a dirge, its bioluminescent glow dimmed and faltering. The rhythmic pulse that once resonated through its sprawling network of life was now erratic, a dying heartbeat that sent waves of unease through both Elias and Kira. Every rustling leaf and flicker of light seemed to whisper urgency. Time was slipping away. Elias stood at the edge of the human expedition camp, his chest tight with anxiety. The camp was a chaotic hive of activity, the hum of machinery slicing through the stillness, oblivious to the destruction it was courting. Captain Sloan's voice barked orders in the distance, her silhouette rigid as she oversaw the drilling crew. The humans were expanding their reach, the machines encroaching on the jungle's sacred ground. To them, the glowing stones buried beneath the soil were an untapped energy source, a boon for their corporate sponsors back on Earth. To Elias, they were the lifeblood of a planet fighting for survival. Beside him, Kira crouched low, her golden eyes scanning the camp with a predator's precision. Her breath came slow and steady, her claws flexing as if preparing for an inevitable fight. She didn't trust the humans, not even Elias's soft assurances that there could be another way. "Wait here," Elias whispered, knowing she wouldn't understand his words, but hoping she'd recognize the intent in his tone. He held her gaze, silently pleading. She growled low, her expression unreadable, but she didn't stop him as he stepped into the open. The camp buzzed with tension as Elias approached, his presence drawing stares from the crew. His dirt-streaked face and disheveled appearance stood out against the orderly uniforms of the expedition team. Captain Sloan spotted him immediately. Her sharp gaze narrowed as she strode toward him, her boots crunching against the packed earth. "Doctor." "Hart," she said, her tone clipped. "You're supposed to be in the observation perimeter. What are you doing here?" Elias took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Captain, you have to stop the operation. Right now." Sloane's eyes flashed with irritation. "This isn't the time for one of your moral grandstands. We're on a tight schedule and the board is expecting results." "This isn't about ethics," Elias shot back, his voice rising. "It's about survival, ours and theirs." He gestured toward the jungle. "The network of stones we've been studying, it's not just some ancient artifact. It's an ecological system, a living network that keeps this planet alive, and we're killing it." Sloane crossed her arms, skepticism etched across her face. "Do you have proof?" "I touched one of the stones," Elias said, his voice fervent. "I felt it. I saw it. The balance is breaking, and if it collapses, this entire planet will die. The jungle will collapse, the atmosphere will destabilize, and everything, Relaxians, humans, everything, will be lost." Sloane didn't respond immediately. The crew around them had fallen silent, their curiosity piqued by Elias's outburst. "You expect me to base a decision on a feeling?" Sloane said finally, her voice laced with incredulity. Elias clenched his fists. "Then come with me. I'll show you. There's still time to stop this, but we have to act now." Sloane hesitated, her gaze hardening as she weighed his words. Before she could respond, a guttural roar split the air. Vorak emerged from the shadows of the jungle, flanked by a group of Relaxians. Their movements were swift and deliberate, their eyes fixed on the camp with a feral intensity. The humans scrambled, drawing their weapons as alarm klaxons blared. Sloane's hand went to her holster, her posture tense. Elias stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Wait!" he shouted. "They're not here to attack. They're here to defend their home." Vorak's eyes burned with fury as he barked something in the Relaxian tongue. Kira stepped into the clearing, her presence commanding as she responded in kind. Her tone was firm, her gestures sharp, but Elias could sense the desperation underlying her words. The two leaders faced each other, their exchange growing more heated as the tension around them thickened. Elias's heart pounded as he stepped between them, his voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't the way," he said, looking between them. "We can't fight each other. The jungle is dying, and if we don't work together, there won't be anything left to fight for." Kira's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding in her golden eyes. Vorak, however, remained rigid, his claws flexing as he growled something low and menacing. Elias turned to Sloane, his voice urgent. "Captain, please stand down. Let me show you what I've seen." For a moment, no one moved. The air was electric, every breath taut with anticipation. Finally, Sloane lowered her weapon. "Show me," she said, her voice tight. Elias led them to the central structure, the humans and Relaxians walking in uneasy truce. The jungle seemed to brighten as they approached, its pulse growing steadier, as if sensing their intent. Inside, Elias guided Sloane to the pedestal where the large glowing stone awaited. "Touch it," he said softly. Sloane hesitated, her skepticism warring with her curiosity. Finally, she reached out, her fingers brushing the stone's surface. Her breath hitched as the vision enveloped her, the weight of the network's collapse, the intertwined fates of the jungle and its inhabitants. It all unfolded before her, leaving her pale and shaken as she pulled her hand away. "You were right," she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias turned to Kira, his expression hopeful. "Now we have a chance." The days that followed were a blur of activity. The humans dismantled their machinery, their focus shifting from exploitation to preservation. Under Elias's guidance, the two species worked together to stabilize the network, using the Relaxians' knowledge and the humans' technology to repair the damage. Vorak remained wary, his mistrust lingering, but he didn't interfere. And when the final connection was restored, the jungle's pulse returned to its steady rhythm, a living symphony of balance and harmony. Elias stood at the edge of the jungle, watching as the first rays of dawn illuminated the canopy. Kira stood beside him, her presence a quiet reassurance. "You saved us," he said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "All of us." She looked at him, her golden eyes filled with something that felt like gratitude. As the jungle came alive around them, Elias felt a sense of closure. The planet had been saved, and though the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, there was hope. A fragile, precious hope that they could build a future together. And in that moment, as the jungle pulsed with life, Elias knew his journey had come full circle. The wind howled across the fractured plains of Zinthera, carrying with it the faint hum of distant energy fields sputtering in decay. Beneath a sky washed in pale indigo light, Yalara stood on the edge of a crumbling precipice, staring into the chasm below. Her violet eyes, streaked with flecks of silver, reflected the ruins of what was once a thriving metropolis. The city of Talius, a gleaming hub of culture and innovation, was now a shadow of its former self, a skeletal graveyard where no echoes dared linger. The air smelled of scorched metal and soil, the aftermath of war clinging to every surface like an unshakable ghost. Yalara's long, obsidian hair billowed behind her, a stark contrast against the ash-streaked landscape. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool, thin atmosphere. In her hand, she clutched a small, glowing crystal, its faint, pulsing light, the last remnant of her partner's life force, extracted moments before his death on the battlefield. She closed her hand around it, feeling its fragile warmth against her palm. It was a relic of grief, a reminder of a promise she had failed to keep. "Ambassador Yalara," a voice called from behind her. She didn't turn immediately. The voice belonged to Shallan, the healer who had been her closest confidant since the war began. Shalin approached with soft, deliberate steps, her presence as soothing as the gentle hum of Zinthera's ancient healing stones. Her cerulean skin glowed faintly under the muted light, and her delicate webbed fingers clutched a satchel filled with medicinal supplies. "They've arrived," Shalin said quietly, her tone laden with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Yalara nodded, but didn't move. "And what impression do they make?" "They seem wary," Shalin replied after a pause. "Their leader, Captain Cross, carries himself like a soldier who has seen too much. His eyes are sharp but haunted. The younger one, Lieutenant Rivera, hides his unease behind humor. He's curious, though. You can see it in the way he looks at everything, like he's trying to understand but isn't sure he wants to." Yalara turned at last, her expression unreadable. "Good," she said simply. "Curiosity is the first step toward understanding." Together, they made their way toward the summit chamber, a towering structure half buried in rubble, but still defiant against the passage of time. Inside, the remnants of the Zinthera Council gathered around an oval table of shimmering crystal. The light within the table pulsed in rhythm with the energy fields that powered it, though its glow was weaker than it had once been, much like the council itself. The human delegation stood on the far side of the room, their military uniforms a stark contrast to the flowing iridescent robes of the Zinthera. Captain Nathan Cross stood at the forefront, his broad shoulders and stern demeanor marking him as a man accustomed to command. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room with measured precision, cataloging every detail. Behind him, Lieutenant Daniel Rivera stood with his arms crossed, his stance relaxed, but his gaze alert. Nathan's eyes locked with Yalara's as she entered the chamber, and for a moment neither spoke. There was something in his gaze that intrigued her, not the usual mix of fear and mistrust she had come to expect from humans, but a quiet intensity that hinted at depths he kept hidden. "Captain Cross," Yalara said, her voice steady and resonant. "Welcome to Talyus, such as it is." Nathan inclined his head. "Ambassador Yalara, thank you for having us." The formality of his tone did not escape her. He was guarded, careful not to reveal too much. A survival instinct, no doubt. The meeting began with the expected exchanges, pleasantries laced with tension, discussions of logistics and rebuilding efforts. Councillor Varric, seated at Yalara's left, watched the humans with thinly veiled disdain. His pale lavender skin seemed to grow darker with every passing minute, his disapproval simmering beneath the surface. When the conversation turned to the future of their alliance, Yalara knew it was time. She straightened in her seat, her gaze sweeping the room. "Captain Cross, Lieutenant Rivera," she began, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the crystal table. "The Zinthera people have suffered greatly. We have lost not just lives, but a part of ourselves, our culture, our identity. It has been fractured." Nathan's brow furrowed, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "We are a matriarchal society," Yalara continued. "For generations our strength has come from our bonds, from the partnerships we forge. The war has left us with too few to rebuild those bonds." Daniel shifted uneasily, sensing where the conversation was heading. "It is for this reason," Yalara said, her gaze locking onto Nathan's, "that I propose a union between our people and yours, between individuals, not just governments." The room fell silent. Nathan's expression was unreadable, but his hands tensed at his sides. "What kind of union?" "A marriage," Yalara said simply. "Between myself and you, Captain Cross, and between my colleague, Shalin, and Lieutenant Rivera." The silence deepened, stretching into an almost tangible weight. Even Shalin looked startled, though she had known this moment was coming. Nathan stared at her, his composure cracking just enough to reveal his shock. "You're serious?" "Entirely," Yalara replied. Daniel, unable to hold back, let out a disbelieving laugh. "You want us to get married, just like that?" "It is not a decision to be made lightly," Yalara said, her tone calm but firm. but it is a decision that must be made. Your presence here is an opportunity, not just to rebuild cities, but to rebuild hope for both our people." Nathan's jaw tightened, his mind clearly racing. "You expect us to agree to this without understanding what it entails? Without knowing anything about your culture, your expectations, your motives?" Yalara leaned forward, her silver-flecked eyes piercing. "You're a soldier, Captain Cross. You know as well as I do that survival often demands choices we are not ready to make. This is one of those moments." The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on the unfolding exchange. In that moment, it was clear. The course of two civilizations was being reshaped, not by battles or treaties, but by a single, audacious proposal. And the mystery of what would come next hung over them all, unspoken, yet undeniable. The room was heavy with silence. The air, once charged with the faint hum of the crystal table, now hung like a thick fog, its weight pressing on Yalara's chest. Her proposal had shattered the stillness, rippling through the atmosphere like a stone dropped into a stagnant pool. She had expected resistance, but the rawness of their disbelief still stung. Nathan's eyes had been a storm, wide, confused, and calculating. But she had seen something else too, a flicker of something darker, something more dangerous. Fear. A silence deeper than the void between their worlds stretched between them. It wasn't just the humans who struggled to grasp the enormity of her offer. It was the Zinthara Council as well. Counselor Varek's expression was one of barely concealed outrage, his skin darkening with barely restrained anger. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers twitching toward the ceremonial dagger at his side. "We are not bargaining with our survival," Varek's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "We are not sending our women to the humans as if they were cattle for trade." Yalara's gaze never wavered. "We are not desperate, Counselor. We are not bargaining. This is about the future." "And what of Zinthara's future?" Varek sneered. "You seek to bind us to the very species that nearly destroyed our world. They have nothing to offer us but their—" He stopped himself, eyes flickering to Nathan and Daniel, his words trailing off into a harsh, bitter silence. Yalara rose slowly, her movements measured, controlled. The weight of her decision, of her conviction, settled around her like a heavy mantle. She addressed the council without flinching. "This is not a matter of vengeance or desperation. It is a matter of survival. Our people need hope, not just in the rebuilding of cities, but in the rebuilding of our spirit." Nathan had not moved since her declaration. He stood beside his delegation, rigid and silent, his gaze fixed firmly on her. She could almost feel the war waging in his mind, the tug-of-war between his military pragmatism and the undeniable humanity that had brought him here, to this strange and broken world. "We have been asked to help you rebuild." Nathan's voice broke through the silence, low and measured. "But you're asking something else entirely. This is not just about helping. This is about changing everything." Yalara's eyes narrowed slightly. "And change is what is needed, Captain." Before Nathan could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his expression lighter yet no less intense. He looked between Yalara and the council, his brow furrowing as he spoke. "You're asking for us to sacrifice what, exactly? Our autonomy? Our identity? These unions might unite our people, but I don't see how." Yalara's gaze softened, and for the first time her voice lost some of its steely resolve. "You do not see it yet, Lieutenant, but in time you will. A bridge between our worlds is not built in a day. It will be difficult, but if we do not try, we lose everything." The room was still. Shalyn stood beside Yalara, her eyes lowered in contemplation. She had said little since the meeting began, but the quiet strength radiating from her was palpable. She was not as certain as Yalara, but she was loyal, and that loyalty was more than enough to sustain their bond. Nathan's gaze shifted briefly to Daniel, then back to Yalara, his expression unreadable. His silence was its own answer. But it was not yet a refusal. The days that followed were filled with quiet tension. The Zinthera delegates and the human peacekeepers moved in carefully orchestrated dances of formality, each side wary, careful not to give offense, yet unable to trust fully. Yalara spent her time in the councils, meeting with the remnants of the Zinthera leadership, trying to keep the fragile peace from unraveling. But even she could feel it, how every step forward was countered by 2 steps of resistance. The proposal hung in the air like a specter. While Shalin worked with the human medical teams to oversee the treatment of the wounded, Yalara found herself alone, caught between 2 worlds. Her decision had already set events in motion, but she could not stop wondering if it was the right one, if her people would ever accept what she had proposed. It was late when Nathan approached her. The corridor outside her quarters was dim, lit by the flickering glow of unstable power cells. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, heavy and deliberate, echoing off the cold stone walls. His silhouette appeared at the threshold of her door, casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the dim light. "You wanted to speak with me," he said. His tone was neither accusatory nor judgmental. He was offering her a moment of clarity, something they both needed. Yalara stepped aside to allow him in. "I wanted to understand you," she said quietly. "I do not think you fully grasp the magnitude of this decision." Nathan closed the door behind him, stepping into the small, sparse room. He was taller than she expected, his presence overwhelming, despite the quiet weight of his posture. "I understand," he said, his voice low. "But it doesn't make sense. Your people are strong, Yalara. You're not desperate. Why are you asking for this?" Yalara's gaze softened as she faced him. "Because our strength is broken. The war has fractured us, Captain. We are like shattered glass. We cannot heal unless we can find a way to come together. And this union is the only way I see forward, for both our peoples." Nathan studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers for some sign of weakness, some trace of deception. But all he found was resolve, steadfast, unwavering. "And if we refuse?" Nathan asked, his voice steady despite the tension hanging between them. "Then we all fall," Yalara replied simply. "We are already teetering on the brink, Captain. If this fails, if we do not try to understand each other, then everything will have been for nothing." Nathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "And if we do agree?" Yalara met his gaze evenly. "Then we begin rebuilding, not just cities, but lives, not just governments, but trust." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was thick, filled with 1,000 unspoken thoughts, fears, and doubts. Then, as if making a decision, Nathan turned on his heel and left, his footsteps fading into the corridor. Yalara stood there, alone in the cold light of her room, the weight of her choice pressing down upon her. The human soldier was not yet convinced, but she had not expected him to be. Trust, after all, could not be demanded. It had to be earned. And as the war-torn landscape outside her window continued to tremble under the weight of their history, Yalara knew one thing with certainty: the road ahead would be treacherous. But it was the only road they had left. The morning after their quiet conversation, Yalara awoke to an unsettling stillness. The usual hum of the energy grids had ceased, leaving only the muffled sounds of the wind through the broken remnants of Tallius's ancient streets. Outside her quarters, the sky hung heavy with dark clouds, more ominous than they had been in weeks. For a moment, she hesitated, sensing that something was wrong. The fragile balance that had been established between her people and the human delegation now seemed more precarious than ever. The corridor was eerily silent when she stepped into it, her footsteps echoing louder than usual against the cold stone walls. As she moved toward the council chambers, her thoughts lingered on Nathan's hesitant words from the night before. "Then we begin rebuilding, not just cities, but lives, not just governments, but trust." But Yalara knew that trust, though vital, was a fragile thing. It could be broken in an instant, shattered beyond repair. She was about to enter the chamber when a sharp crackling sound filled the air. A sudden burst of static jolted her from her thoughts, followed by the unmistakable tone of a distress signal blaring from the communication console. "Ambassador Yalara," a voice called out from the other side of the chamber. It was one of her closest aides, their face pale with worry. "We've intercepted an encrypted transmission. It's, from Counselor Varric." Yalara's heart tightened. Varric, a man who had long been a thorn in her side, had never shown any inclination to cooperate with the peace efforts. His fierce opposition to the Unions, combined with his history of secretive behavior, now seemed like a troubling omen. She strode toward the console, her mind racing. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flickering blue light of the communication grid. Her aide worked quickly, typing commands into the console to bring the transmission to life. The screen flickered for a moment before revealing a grainy image of Varric's face. His expression was tight, his features shadowed by the poor quality of the transmission. Yet there was something unmistakable in his eyes: fear. "Ambassador Yalara," Varric's voice came through, distorted and strained. "You need to stop this alliance. It's too late to turn back now. The humans, they've found something we weren't supposed to know." Yalara's breath caught in her throat. The urgency in Varric's voice, the uncharacteristic vulnerability, sent a chill down her spine. "What are you talking about, Counselor?" she demanded. "I can't explain it all," Varric said, his voice barely audible over the static. "But the humans, they've discovered something beneath the ruins of Talius. A weapon that could change everything. You need to stop them before they uncover it all." His image flickered again, the screen distorting as the transmission cut out. Yalara stood frozen, her mind spinning with questions. What weapon was Varric referring to? And why was he so desperate to keep it hidden? Her instincts screamed at her to investigate, but she also knew that the Council, already suspicious of her dealings with the humans, would not take kindly to her defying Varric's warning. The stakes had just been raised, and whatever secret Varric was trying to keep buried threatened to unravel everything she had worked for. Without another word, Yalara turned and hurried toward the outer chambers, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls seemed to close in around her as she moved, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her every step. Captain Nathan Cross was not expecting a visitor when Yalara arrived at his quarters, but she found him sitting at his desk, hunched over a set of data pads, his brow furrowed in concentration. The soldier's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the urgency she felt. As she entered, he didn't look up immediately, as though lost in thought. "Captain Cross," Yalara began, her voice tinged with tension. "I need you to listen to me, now." He glanced up, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What's happened?" he asked, pushing aside the data pads and standing up. "There's something you need to know," Yalara said, her voice dropping lower as though even the walls themselves might be listening. "Counselor Varric just sent a distress message. He claims you've uncovered something in the ruins. Something dangerous. A weapon." Nathan's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "We've been working to uncover whatever we can from the wreckage. The city's a mess, but—" "No." Yalara cut him off, her words sharp. "This isn't a reconstruction project. This is something more." Nathan took a step closer, sensing the rising tension in her words. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Yalara paused for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the window where the distant skyline of Talius lay in ruins. "Whatever it is you found, it's not just a relic of war. It's a weapon, and Counselor Varric believes it could change the course of everything. Our alliance, your people's involvement here." Nathan didn't speak at first, absorbing the weight of her words. Then his jaw tightened. "And you believe him?" "I believe there's more to this than we know, and I believe Varric's hiding something. But the question is, what?" Yalara's voice was steady, yet there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Her certainty had faltered, now clouded by the complexity of what lay ahead. Before Nathan could respond, an alarm blared through the compound, its shrill sound cutting through the air like a blade. The color drained from his face. "What the hell is that?" he asked, already moving toward the door. Yalara's eyes widened. "It's a breach, at the excavation site." They both rushed out into the corridor, their footsteps echoing as they sprinted toward the commotion. As they emerged into the courtyard, the first signs of chaos were already unfolding. Soldiers were gathering around the entrance to the excavation site, a mass of them bristling with weapons, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. Yalara's heart sank as she saw the smoke rising from the ruins ahead. There was something wrong, something far worse than just a simple accident. It wasn't just the excavation site, it was the ground itself that seemed to tremble. "We need to move now," Nathan said, his voice low and commanding. Without hesitation, they both pushed through the crowd, reaching the site's perimeter. A deep crater had opened in the earth, revealing a massive structure buried beneath the ruins. But it wasn't the structure that caught Yalara's attention. It was the energy reading, pulsing erratically from within. She could feel the force of it, the way it vibrated through the air, sending ripples across the surface of her skin. "What is that?" she breathed, her voice barely audible above the rising tension. Nathan's gaze hardened. "It's not just a weapon, Yalara. It's something else, something we weren't supposed to find." Yalara's blood ran cold as the magnitude of what was unfolding began to settle over her. They hadn't just uncovered a weapon, they had awakened something far older, far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. And the race to control it had just begun. As the soldiers set up a perimeter around the excavation site, Yalara couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in control. The shadow of the past had risen once more, and whatever lay hidden beneath the earth was a force that could change everything. The earth trembled beneath their feet, sending shockwaves through the fractured ruins of Talius. The smoke from the breach swirled in the heavy, dust-choked air, as if the land itself were trying to expel the secret that had been buried within it for eons. Yalara's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening as she stood at the edge of the crater. The force of the energy pulsed from below, an unsettling hum vibrating through her bones, as though it were calling to something or someone within her. Nathan stood beside her, his face set in grim determination, his military instincts already kicking in. But even he, trained to handle conflict, appeared unsettled. His eyes scanned the perimeter, the soldiers surrounding them. But there was something in the air that made even the seasoned soldiers pause, a deep, unsettling anticipation, as if the very ground were holding its breath. Yalara's gaze fell to the glowing energy, rippling like liquid fire just beneath the surface. It was coming from the structure they had uncovered, a massive, ancient edifice half sunk in the earth, its jagged edges blackened by time. She could feel it now, the deep resonance of something other, something that wasn't supposed to be here, something that had been hidden for a reason. "We need to move," Nathan said, his voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "Whatever this is, it's not safe." "I agree," Yalara said, though her voice was tight with unease. The choice before them was heavy, impossible. She could already see the faint outlines of her future, drawn with blood, betrayal, and secrets yet to be unveiled. But she had no other choice, no other path forward. But as they moved toward the edge of the excavation, a sudden, piercing shriek shattered the tense calm. The sound was unnatural, almost inhuman, and it froze Yalara in place. A dark shape emerged from the rubble, something moving, something alive beneath the earth. The soldiers shouted in alarm, raising their weapons as the ground cracked open further, revealing a glowing figure rising from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its form towering and distorted. It was humanoid in shape, but something more, something ancient. The skin was blackened, as though burned by the very energy it contained, and its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. It was a living being, but one twisted by time and forgotten power. Its aura radiated darkness and menace, every movement slow but deliberate, as though it had been awakened from a centuries-long slumber. Yalara's heart skipped a beat. What have we uncovered? The creature's gaze fell upon her, and for a moment their eyes locked, her heart racing with the sudden, terrible realization that it knew her, knew them. It was as though it recognized the bloodline of the Zinthera, the soul of her people. Before anyone could react, the creature's hand shot forward, sending a wave of energy pulsing outward. The blast struck with the force of 100 storms, knocking soldiers off their feet and sending Yalara sprawling into the dirt. Her head spun, her vision blurred with the shockwave's impact. But through the haze, she saw Nathan struggling to regain his footing. His eyes locked on her, his expression intense with focus. "Stay down," he shouted, but his words were lost to the chaos around them. Yalara's breath was ragged as she pulled herself up, instinctively reaching for the communicator at her belt. The situation had gone from bad to worse in an instant. The creature was no longer just a discovery, it was a threat. And it wasn't just a threat to them, it was a threat to everything they had fought for. But in that moment, something changed. As the creature's eerie glow filled the air, Yalara felt a strange pull, an undeniable connection. The feeling was as if the creature were reaching out to her, its ancient mind seeking something in her that she couldn't name. "Captain!" Yalara shouted, her voice rising above the fray. "We need to get closer. We need to find out what it wants." Nathan hesitated, his hand hovering over his weapon, but then he nodded. He understood the urgency in her voice. Together they moved toward the towering figure, dodging falling debris and the remaining soldiers who scrambled to regain control of the situation. The creature seemed to react to their approach, its form shifting, the energy crackling with raw power as it turned toward them. It was then that Yalara saw it, a symbol etched into the creature's chest, a symbol that matched one she had seen in the ancient texts of the Zinthara, buried deep within their archives. A symbol of a lost faction, an order that had disappeared long before the war. This being was not just a relic of the past, it was part of a legacy, a forbidden history. "This is no ordinary weapon," Yalara whispered, her heart pounding. "This is something far older, something we were never meant to find." Nathan's face was set in grim resolve as he continued forward, his expression hardening. "Then we need to stop it before it stops us." But as they closed the gap, the creature's glowing eyes locked onto Nathan, and with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached out. The energy surged once more, but this time, it wasn't a blast of raw power. It was a pull, a draw, as if the creature were trying to drag Nathan closer. Yalara shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the force of the pull. The ground beneath them began to crack open wider, and the entire excavation site seemed to shift. It was as if the land itself were rearranging to free this creature, this entity, from its prison. The sense of dread that had been building only intensified. Then, in an unexpected twist, the creature spoke, not in words, but in a voice that echoed through their minds, low and ancient, filled with an unsettling authority. "You are not the first to seek this power." The words reverberated in Yalara's chest, and she felt the weight of them press down on her with terrible force. She staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but she couldn't look away. This was the truth. This was the force that had shaped the history of their people, and it would shape their future as well. The creature's gaze never left her as it spoke again, the voice like thunder rolling through her mind. "I want what was taken from me." The words chilled her to the bone, and for the first time since her arrival on Talius, Yalara felt a deep, incomprehensible fear. The creature was not merely a weapon, it was a force of nature, bound by vengeance, and it had waited centuries for its chance to strike. Before she could process what had just been revealed, the ground beneath them gave way completely, and the creature's power surged outward. The soldiers panicked, scattering in all directions as the crater deepened, and the sky above darkened further, as though the very heavens had grown aware of what was unfolding below. Yalara barely had time to grab Nathan's arm before the ground split open completely, and they were swallowed into the darkness below. As they fell, Yalara's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, uncertain of the future, afraid for the people she had promised to protect. But one thing was clear: their world had just shifted. And whatever this creature was, it had not come alone. The mysteries that had begun with a simple proposal now twisted into something far more dangerous and far more powerful than she had ever imagined. The air was heavy with the weight of unspoken words. The ruins of the Zinthera capital stretched before them, a silent testament to the devastation they had endured. Yet, despite the blackened sky and the smoldering earth beneath their feet, something had changed in the air. The world felt different now, as if it were holding its breath before an inevitable shift. Yalara stood at the precipice of the great chasm that had once been a bustling city center. Around her, the survivors of the devastation, both human and Zinthera, worked quietly, almost reverently, clearing rubble, repairing structures, and tending to the wounded. The land was scarred, but it was alive, and with it, so too were the people. They had survived, against all odds. Beside her, Nathan Cross stood tall, his expression unreadable, but his eyes reflected a weariness that ran deep. They had come a long way together since the first time she had approached him, since the day she had proposed the impossible, the unimaginable, the union of their peoples. The fire between them had burned brightly, at times threatening to consume them both, but now it had settled into something more enduring, something born of respect, of shared loss, and of quiet hope. "I didn't think we'd make it this far," Nathan said, his voice low, almost to himself. Yalara turned to him, her gaze soft but firm. "You've always been a soldier, Captain. You've learned how to survive, and now so have we." Nathan gave a small, rueful smile. "I don't know about that. We've got a long way to go before I'm calling this a victory." There was truth in his words. The destruction they had witnessed, the creature, the ancient forces it had unleashed, the collapse of the world they had fought to rebuild, was not something that could be so easily forgotten. But there was something else, something deeper in Nathan's voice that Yalara couldn't quite place. A hint of resolve, a quiet acceptance of the unknown. "It's not about victory," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "It's about change." Before Nathan could respond, a voice called from behind them. "Captain, Lieutenant, Counselor Varric wishes to speak with you." They both turned to find Lieutenant Daniel Rivera approaching them, his face set with determination. Behind him, a group of Zinthera elders, including the formidable Counselor Varric, stood waiting. Varric's gaze was as cold as ever, his sharp features set in a grim line. Yalara took a step forward, her posture proud yet measured. Varric had been the staunchest opposition to her plan from the beginning, a conservative force within the Zinthera Council who had openly criticized the unions between their people. Yet, in the wake of everything that had transpired, he was no longer the same man. He too had changed. "I was not expecting this," Varric said as they approached, his voice clipped, but not without a trace of something else, perhaps reluctance. "You, both of you, have proven that there is more to this alliance than I had imagined." "Is that so?" Yalara's tone was careful, but there was a flicker of triumph behind her eyes. "What has changed your mind, Counselor?" Varric's gaze flickered briefly to Nathan, then back to her. "The people are tired of fighting, tired of the bloodshed. But more than that, they are afraid of a future that seems uncertain. What you have done, what both of you have done, is show us that there is hope, that we can rebuild not just our world, but ourselves." Yalara felt a quiet ripple of something deep inside her, relief perhaps, or something more akin to closure. The battle for acceptance, for understanding, had not been an easy one. But this moment, this quiet acknowledgement, was something she had hoped for. "There's still much to be done," Nathan said, stepping forward with a glance at Yalara. "But the future is ours to shape, if we're willing to work for it." Varric nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as if weighing the truth of the words. "Indeed." The counselor was silent for a long moment before speaking again, his voice heavy. "There will be changes in the council, perhaps even in the way we view the humans. and the Zinthara who have bonded with them. Yalara's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for this, but the reality of it, the prospect of change on such a large scale, felt as surreal as it did necessary. They were on the cusp of something profound, and for the first time, she felt the weight of that potential settle fully within her. "Then we have work to do," she said, her voice low but resolute. As they moved toward the council, Yalara noticed that the tension between her people and the humans had started to ebb. What had once been a chasm between their cultures, a vast divide built on misunderstandings and prejudice, was now beginning to close. The walls that had separated them, cultural, emotional, political, were crumbling piece by piece as the mutual respect between individuals grew. And there, at the heart of it all, was the unlikely alliance between her and Nathan. Their bond, born from grief and loss, had transformed into something far more enduring, not just a marriage of convenience, but a partnership that could guide both their peoples toward a future none of them had imagined. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Daniel said, his voice light but tinged with something deeper. He was walking alongside Shalin, his expression softened in a way that spoke volumes. Their journey, too, had been one of growth, of personal healing, and the bond between them had become just as powerful as Yalara's and Nathan's. Shalin, who had been quietly watching the exchange, finally spoke. "Perhaps we've all come further than we realize." Yalara turned to her, a soft smile on her lips. "Indeed." The ceremony was small, a simple but profound gathering of those who had chosen to stay and rebuild. Under the fading light of a blood-red sky, Yalara and Nathan stood before the council, their hands clasped together as they made their vows, not just to each other, but to the people they had sworn to protect. In that moment, Yalara felt a strange peace settle in her heart. The uncertainty of the future, the dark shadows of the past, they were still there, lingering on the edges of her mind, but for the first time, she felt ready to face them, to build something new from the wreckage of what had been. Nathan's fingers tightened around hers, and she looked up at him, meeting his steady gaze. The war was over. The rebuilding had begun. But more than that, a new chapter was unfolding before them, one that held promises of unity, of hope, and of love in the face of adversity. The land may have been broken, but together they would heal it. Together they would forge a new future, one where love and understanding could bridge even the deepest of divides. And perhaps, one day, this story would be told as the beginning of a new era, a story of two species who had dared to dream of something better, something lasting. The sky, once shrouded in the darkness of war, now held the first glimmer of dawn.